Hey guys, how are you? So, why is using APIs standard in modern day development? There are two big reasons. Reason number one, they save you a lot of time. With APIs, which is short for Application Programming Interface, these are basically ways for you to access third-party apps that are typically sitting on the web, and you can access them, typically pay a little fee, adding lots of functionality to your website. So it could be simple things like adding a scraper functionality where you can, instead of building a scraper from scratch, which you can do with Python, for example, well, many languages, but there's all these little gotchas in creating a scraper. And this is just an example. So by using a third-party scraper that is exposed to you, meaning it allows you access to that third-party scraper program via their API, Application Programming Interface, an interface that's done by programming to a certain application. I hope that kind of makes sense. Anyway, so you would use this third-party API to save you time. So instead of writing the scraper from scratch, might as well just pay a small fee and access the API of the scraper. So a question that comes up, when would you use an API versus building from scratch? You would use an API for certain functionality that may be important for your application, but not the center reason for your application. This video is sponsored by API Layer. API Layer, API 1, so to protect, go back and to air, it's your own. So for functionality for website for a business, and you want to add mapping functionality to that business, meaning you want to add a visual interactive map that viewers of that business's website can interact with, click on it, maybe get reviews, get direction locations. Of course, you're not going to build this from scratch. That would be a monumental job. You would just utilize the Google Maps API. Very simple example, an unbelievably obvious example, I admit, but you can think about this in terms of all kinds of different types of applications. So use APIs to extend the capability of your website or your web app or your application. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the web. Accessing these third-party APIs will save you a lot of time so you can concentrate on your core functionality that you're trying to deliver. The second reason to use APIs is to save you bugs, save you from bugs. Again, the two reasons, time and bugs. You want to avoid wasting time on non-central functionality in terms of what you want to deliver. And number two, you want to eliminate debugging. Debugging is the most time-consuming aspect of development, you could argue, probably the most frustrating. So when you are licensing a third-party API, you don't have to worry about the details and the functionality behind the scenes. That's all taken care of for you. You just access the API, that's it. A lot less bugs for you to contend with. Think about it this way. Over time, functionality for an API or functionality for some backend system that you're accessing through an API needs to be updated on occasions. Things change. So if you are building the application yourself and you need to constantly update it, that's work. It's a pain in the butt. But if you're using a third-party API, the assumption is that they will upgrade it and they will keep debugging and refining it as they have many users as they need to. Years ago, I decided to build our own blogging engine using PHP Laravel. That's what we were using at the time. And it was quite easy to do with Laravel, quite easy to do in fact. The problem is that it had to always be updated. It had to always be updated based on whatever circumstances came about. Security issues, functionality we want to add. Whereas WordPress is all there, turnkey. We don't have to worry about security issues with it because it is being updated now. Don't get me wrong. WordPress can be a security nightmare if you're using a lot of plugins, which you shouldn't use. Use plugins with caution. Use the commercial ones, make sure they're vetted. But anyway, that's another story. Point is that I decided to shut down our own blogging engine because might as well just use WordPress. Same thing, I had built at one point my own newsletter system, and it was pretty robust. But again, as time went by, I didn't want to be in the business of continuously trying to keep my newsletter software up to date. I wanted to just work on my core business. So I shut that down, and I just went with a third party to manage the whole newsletter thing. So APIs can be broad, like implementing a complete, well, an API is not using a CMS. That was just an example of reusing third-party code so that I'd save my man hours, my coding hours, not trying to maintain a non-central aspect of whatever services that I was providing. Anyway, so Google Maps is a better example. I'm not going to build a whole mapping application. I'm just going to use Google Maps, and that just saves me a heck of a lot of time with all this great functionality for minimal cost. So let me conclude with my top 3 rules of software development. Number 1, reuse. Number 2, reuse. Number 3, reuse. Reusing other people's code, whether it is through an API or whether you use a complete application like WordPress or a newsletter system, only makes sense. Don't go looking for code to write as a developer. First thing you do when a project lands on your lap as a developer, you look around to see what else is out there, whether it be APIs or full-blown systems, open source or otherwise, that you can leverage. Because trust me, there's going to be plenty of code for you to write in your career. Don't go looking for it. All right, I hope you found this video useful. I'm Uncle Steph. By the way, I have a mentoring program / bootcamp. If you want to be mentored by me, somebody who's been coding since the early 90s, check out the link below, unclesteph.com.
All right. Today is Sunday, the 14th of August, and this is a recap for the stock market activities last week and an outlook for the week to come. And folks, I got a good one for you tonight, but before we start, 3 important points. Note number 1, if you received any message from me, whether it is on YouTube, Twitter, or otherwise, telling you to click on a certain link or to contact a certain number for a steal in the first day, I do for a video. So information at all you've ever watched tonight Have you forgotten that we have seen this movie before? Well, maybe you've forgotten, maybe you're not even aware. I'm going to remind you with all of it using the data and the facts. And let's start by this. There is a massive rebound rally going on in the stock market right now. And we have talked that Friday's close was an important close because it marks the beginning of a bull market. It marks the end of the bear market. And the level is 4,231. And the technicians using this theory are referring to the Fibonacci retracement levels, where we market from the top of the market all the way to the, for now, assumed to be bottom. We have a retracement, a rebound rally that erased 50% of the losses since the top. And therefore, a lot of technicians are saying this is the end of the bear market and the beginning of a new bull market. Here's the problem. These technicians are using the Fibonacci retracement model, measuring from the top to the assumed bottom. Now, this is not the best way to use the Fibonacci retracement levels because you're assuming that this is the bottom, but you don't know it is for sure. Now, I'm not saying that this is wrong and a mistake in using the Fibonacci model. I have used it before in certain trades, most famously shorting Viacom before the Archegos disaster, and that happens to be one of my best trades in history. But the way I use the Fibonacci model usually is measuring from the bottom all the way to the top because we know for sure that this is indeed the bottom and this is indeed the top. So we have a certain degree of accuracy in using the Fibonacci model. When we do that, the result is the same. The numbers change. I have 4,200. This is my number. And the chart right now, this is a weekly chart of the SPX, the cash index of the S&P 500. The chart is trading above 4,200 decisively, and it closed above that level for the week. We look at the MACD indicator, it is firming higher. We have a successful crossing indicating the end of the bearish momentum and the start of a new bullish momentum about a couple of weeks ago. Now, we're going to face some resistance if we go higher from here. The resistance that I see right now, the immediate one, is 4,307.66. This is a level where the chart got rejected from before. It also coincides with the sloping line of resistance since the top. So what are you saying, Maverick? Are you saying that this is the bottom and higher we go, back to all-time highs? The bear market is over? Are you agreeing finally? Not really, and I'll tell you why. Let's talk about market bottoms first, and then we're going to talk about bear market rallies. When we talk about market bottoms, we have two kinds of market bottoms, the gradual kind and the spike kind. In a gradual bottom, usually it is a process that takes about a year or more. Likewise, in a gradual bottom, we see a retest of that bottom before the market goes higher again. And in this kind of bottom, it happens because we have selling exhaustion. Now, the other kind, the spike market bottom, usually lasts less than a year. We see a massive move higher from the bottom. We don't see a retest. There's no retest of the bottom. And the reason for the bottom is a Fed pivot, meaning the Fed changing the monetary policy from tightening to easing again, or even injecting a new wave of liquidity. Now, let's look at historical cases. Here's the SPX, once again, the cash index for the S&P 500. This is a weekly chart, and we go all the way back since the dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble bottom was actually a gradual bottom. Then we have another major bottom in 2009, the great financial crisis. This was a spike bottom. And then we have the Brexit scare around 2015, 2016. This was a gradual bottom. Then we have the famous Fed pivot in 2018, 2019. This was a spike bottom. Likewise, the Thing crash in 2020 was also a spike bottom. And now the assumption is that we have another spike bottom because the Fed has pivoted, but we have peak inflation. Regardless of the assumptions, let's zoom in more to each one of these bottoms and see how they look. Before we do that, just a reminder, before the peak of the dot-com bubble, we got a small baby bear market in 1998. This was a gradual bottom because you see the double bottom, the retest. Of course, it doesn't get to the penny because you have algorithmic programs with different numbers. You have traders who cannot get it exactly at the previous bottom, but the look is clear. You have a double bottom, a gradual process that lasted less than a year before the market started to rally again. So it is a gradual bottom, but it violates one rule, that is the time. It should be a year or more. And this is why we call it a baby bear market. But the legitimate bear market in the aftermath of the implosion of the dot-com bubble, as you can see, the bottom happened in 2002, and it was a gradual bottom, double bottom formation, a retest, and then years later in 2004, when we became sure that this is indeed the end of the bear market. Another case, 2009, the great financial crisis. This was a spike bottom. There is no retest at all. The Fed injected a massive wave of liquidity to rescue the economy, and immediately the stock market reacted and moved higher and never looked back. Here's another case in 2015, 2016, the Brexit scare, a gradual process that took about a year or so, a double bottom, and then it moved higher and never looked back. And here are the last two cases in 2018, 2019, the famous Fed pivot. It was a spike bottom, no retest at all. It happened within a few weeks, and the market was at all-time highs once again. It never looked back until 2020. We got the crash, the virus, and as you can see, a spike bottom, no retest at all. Why? Because the Fed unleashed the biggest tsunami of liquidity in human history and cut interest rates to zero. And it took a few months before the market made all-time highs once again. We look at what we have right now. We have a spike bottom, no retest so far. It took about a couple of months, if not less, before the market already erased half of the losses since the top. The only missing ingredient here to assume that this is indeed a spike market bottom is the fact that we don't have a Fed pivot. We're not even sure if we have peak inflation at all. So unlike previous spike bottoms, this bottom is missing a major ingredient, which is there is no pivot. Unless the Fed is bluffing and lying to us, we don't have a pivot for now. So this is a false assumption that the June bottom is indeed a bottom at all, without having confirmation that the Fed is indeed pivoting. Now let's talk about bear market rallies. We go back in the dot-com bubble, SPX weekly chart for the cash index of the S&P 500. Since the top, we got major bear market rallies. Matter of fact, the first rally was around 10%. The one after that was a little over 21.5%. The one after that was around 24.5%. The last one was also around 24.5%. Notice that as we go down, bear market rallies become even more aggressive. Here's the problem. So are the pullbacks. See, the first pullback was around 21.5%. The second pullback was around 28%. The third pullback was around 34%. And then the last pullback was less than that, around 20%. And that's how we knew that this is indeed the bottom. All in all, the SPX, the S&P 500 lost over 50% of its value in the implosion of the dot-com bubble. What do we have today? Same chart, SPX, S&P 500 weekly chart. We got major bear market rallies. The first one was worth about 9%. The second one was worth about 13%. And the latest one is already exceeding 17.5%. So as you can see, the bear market rallies are getting more intense, more aggressive, and so are the pullbacks. Pullback number one was worth about 10.5%. Pullback number two was worth over 17.5%. And the question here is, are we going to see another pullback? And this is just yet another bear market rally. If we do, this is going to be a major pullback that will take us down all the way to the consolidation range from September to November of 2020. And the median of that range will produce a drop from this point on. If the SPX moves a little higher to my resistance that I just talked about a few minutes ago, the drop will be worth at around 21.5%. This will be the median. But this will not happen without one stock going down. If this stock doesn't go down, then the stock market will not go down. And this stock is, you guessed it, Apple. As Apple goes, so will the market. It is the most important stock in the market. It has the heaviest weighting across all major ETFs. If this name doesn't go down, the stock market is not going to go down. But if this stock goes down, the stock market will go down and form a lower low. So let's take a look at Apple, the weekly chart. We got a drop since the top early this year that is worth about 29.5%. Since then, Apple has rebounded, a major rebound that is worth about 33.5% so far. A lot of folks will look at that and say this is a major sign that the bear market is over. Otherwise, why would Apple rally by about 33.5%? So either the bear market is indeed over, or this has to be one of the biggest mistakes in stock market history. And my response to that is, we have seen this movie exactly the same way before. This is not our first rodeo. If we go back to 2008, similar conditions, just like we have right now, the stock of Apple crashed since the top by about 43%. And then came the Fed's pivot. And this was a legitimate pivot because in late 2007, the Fed was cutting interest rates in response to the housing crisis and the rise in unemployment. But they made a major move. Some of you might remember that. I do. In January of 2008, when the Fed made an emergency rate cut on January 30th, worth about 50 basis points. That indicated to the market that the Fed is serious about cutting rates and pivoting because the Fed since 2004 2004 has been raising rates on autopilot. They got the Fed interest rate from 1.25% in June 2004 all the way to 5.25% in June 2006. Now, in response to the January 30 emergency rate cut, the stock market bounced in a big way. And as you can see from the headline from 2008, it reads, Fed's caution causes markets to recoil. What else they said back then? January 2008, the Fed cut gives stocks soft landing. Sounds familiar? And indeed, Apple rallied by about 66.5%. Everybody back then assumed that the worst is behind us, and higher we go. And then what happened? Everybody became complacent. The VIX crashed. This headline from the LA Times illustrates that. The headline reads, more panic, please. Stock market fear gauge suggests a relative lack of concern. That is often bearish. What do we have right now? The VIX cracking below 20. Everybody says the sky is clear, the bear market is over. This is actually a bearish sign, not a bullish one. And after rallying by over 66%, Apple crashed by about 59% from that point on. So that rally was a mere bear market rally. Another case, going back to the dot-com bubble, Apple crashed from the top by about 47%, and then it caught a major bear market rally that is worth almost 59%. And then what happened? Apple crashed again and lost about 79% of its value. And what we see right now in Apple's chart today, a major rally worth almost 33.5%. But is it going to end up being just like the bear market rallies that we got in 2008 and 2000? That depends on two things. Number one, do we have a legitimate Fed pivot? Number two, are the fundamentals in Apple improving or not? You know the answer to question number one. We don't have a legitimate Fed pivot right now. But what is the answer to question number two? We look at the net income growth year over year for Apple. In the last quarterly earnings report, we found out that Apple's net income went down by over 10.5% year over year. Even during the height of the virus scare in 2020 and the lack of demand, Apple did not lose 10.5% in profits. The trend is going down. The bottom line for the company has already peaked. It is trending down. Negative earnings. So does this justify Apple stock going back to all-time highs? Something everybody must think about. Because if the answer is no, and Apple goes down and it breaks its lows since the rebound rally, then guess what? The June bottom in the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq will open like a sinkhole, and nobody's paying attention to that. Everybody is absolutely occupied with the rally and the fear of missing out. Look at the divergence between Apple and the S&P 500. Apple has recently opened a major gap, outperforming the S&P 500. Usually that gap gets closed, and this is yet another sign that the rally in Apple is overdone. Everybody likes to look at these bear market rallies tick by tick. When they see stocks rallying by 10, 20%, of course they're going to get indulged. Of course they're going to get sucked in. But those with experience, using the data and the facts, we know until we have a legitimate Fed pivot, until we see earnings improving, until we see the risk of recession gone, we don't have a bottom yet. And this is just another bear market rally that we've seen before over and over and over again. Here's the big short Michael Burry. He tweeted, Nasdaq now up 23% off its low. Congratulations. We now have the average bear market rally. He's right. I just showed you that. Across 26 bear market rallies from 1929, 1932, and 2000, 2002, the average is 23%. After 2000, there were two 40% plus bear market rallies and one 50% plus rally before the market bottom. And of course, the big short got a lot of hate. They're taunting him, they're making fun of him. You're missing out, bro. You're wrong. Or you're too early. Look, in battle between the big short and the big guy, he got it right twice when everybody assumed that this is the new normal. He called it before everybody and got it right. Most importantly, bet on it, made hundreds of millions of dollars. Or am I going to trust the big diaper, the traders who showed up in 2020? They barely have 2 years worth of experience, but they think this is the new normal. They're the new captain of the ship now. Haven't we all heard this before multiple times? The answer is yes. With that, folks, this is all I got for you for now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I will talk to you again soon.
Before touching any of it, welcome to the Making Sense Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Well, it's been a big week for news. I think I'm going to wait for a few more shoes to drop before touching any of it. Earlier in the week, Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago. Is that really his home? That golf club that looks like a dictator's palace in what he might call a shithole country. It was raided by, quote, raided by the FBI in search of misappropriated documents that may or may not contain secrets about nuclear weapons or nuclear policy or something nuclear. Again, I think I'll wait for more information to surface before I comment on this, but needless to say, it would not surprise me if Trump had done something terrifyingly inept and self-serving and even nefarious. So let's just wait and see what happens there. I share many people's concern that the execution of this search warrant is inflammatory enough that the facts, in the end, don't seem to merit it. It will be yet another thing that bolsters Trump's political stature in the personality cult that has subsumed the Republican Party. And that would be a bad thing. Once again, this is an asymmetrical war of ideas, and any misstep that seems to suggest that our institutions have become politicized, in this case the FBI, run, we should note, by a Trump appointee, Christopher Wray, not the fittest object for allegations of anti-Trump partisanship, really. But any apparent bias here makes any further discussion of facts more or less impossible. So anyway, let's wait for the dust to settle. Let's see what was actually in those boxes. And maybe there'll be more to say. And then yesterday, the author Salman Rushdie was attacked on stage by a man who was in a knife under conditions where he obviously did not have enough security. And it sounds like he is on life support now. So that obviously is terrible. And I share everyone's horror on his account. I said as much on Twitter not so many hours ago, where I wrote, like many of you, I'm thinking about Salman Rushdie now. The threat he's lived under for so long, which was so horrifically realized today, is the product not merely of the hatred and fear of religious fanatics, but of the cowardice and confusion of secularists. Everyone in arts and letters should have stood shoulder to shoulder with Salman in 1989, thereby distributing the risk. And the fact that so few did is a moral scandal that still casts its shadow over the present. And I now notice in my ad mentions that I am being attacked by many people for being soft on Islam and for using the phrase religious fanatics out of an apparent unwillingness to name Islam and its theology as the culpable party here. All I can say is I'm surprised and somewhat amused by this, and these are people who clearly don't know my history. I have been accused of Islamophobia even more than I've been accused of having Trump arrangements. It might surprise some of you to learn. Anyway, my conscience on that score is quite clear, and I invite those of you who doubt my bona fides as a critic of Islam to do some Googling. I even wrote an op-ed with Salman in defense of our mutual friend, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, 2007. That's on my blog somewhere. I believe the title is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Abandoned to Fanatics. It was published in the Los Angeles Times, but I think it's behind a paywall there. Anyway, I don't actually know Salman, despite the fact that we wrote that op-ed together. That was accomplished by email. We've never met in person, which surprises me. We've always had several good friends in common, Ayaan being one, Hitch being another. Salman was one of Hitch's best friends. I was merely a friend. Anyway, thinking about him, and I would just say, by way of spelling out further the point I was making on Twitter, my use of the phrase religious fanatic was not at all an instance of my mincing words with respect to Islam, although I can see how someone might have thought that if they were unfamiliar with my work. I was just assuming enough familiarity with what I have said and written on this topic that it simply never occurred to me that I could be accused of pandering to Islamic extremists here, or just confused liberal secularists who would support such pandering. I just assumed my reputation preceded me here. Anyway, the real point I was making here was that the problem has always been larger than mere Islamic extremism and its intolerance to free speech. This extremism has been given an immense amount of oxygen by confused and cowardly and, in some cases, well-intentioned people who worry that any criticism of Islam will give energy to racism and xenophobia. Salman was attacked by such people from the moment the Ayatollah pronounced his fatwa, and the list of people who rushed to heap shame upon their heads by criticizing a novelist forced into hiding out of deference for the sensitivities of religious lunatics is an awful list of names, and so it is with more recent atrocities, like the Charlie Hebdo massacre. People who explicitly or implicitly took the side of the jihadist murderers and criticizing the butchered cartoons for their alleged insensitivity. These are people who are still in good standing in many cases, and I'm not aware that any have apologized. Certainly got those moments of moral and political emergency so disastrously wrong. I'm doing my best not to name names here, but anyone interested can see who took the side of religious barbarians. And there have been so many moments like that since the fatwa on Salman was first pronounced. And many of you who are living by podcast and Substack newsletter might take a look, because some of your modern free speech heroes were people who thought that just maybe those cartoonists had it coming to them. Anyway, this is an awful thing. I hope Salman recovers, and whatever happens there, if there's more to say, I'll do a podcast on it. Okay. Today I'm speaking with Will MacAskill. Will is an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Oxford and a TED speaker, a past Forbes 30 Under 30 social entrepreneur. He also co-founded the Center for Effective Altruism, which has raised over $1 billion for charities. And he's the author, most recently, of a wonderful book titled What We Owe the Future. And that is in part the topic of today's discussion. I'll read you the blurb I wrote for that book, because it'll give you a sense of how important I think Will's work is. No living philosopher has had a greater impact upon my ethics than Will MacAskill. In What We Owe the Future, MacAskill has transformed my thinking once again. by patiently dismantling the lazy intuitions that rendered me morally blind to the interests of future generations. This is an altogether thrilling and necessary book. And that pretty much says it. The book is also blurbed by several friends: Paul Bloom, Jim Urban, Stephen Fry. As you'll hear, Will has been getting a lot of press recently. It's a New Yorker profile that came out a couple of days ago. Also, the cover of Time magazine was devoted to him and the effective altruism movement. And all of it's great to see. So Will and I get into the book. We talk about effective altruism in general and its emphasis on long-termism and existential risk. We talk about criticisms of the philosophy and some of the problems with expected value reasoning. We talk about the difference between doing good and feeling good, why it's so hard to care about future people, how the future gives meaning to the present, why this moment in history is unusual, the pace of economic and technological growth. We discuss man's personal incentives, value lock-in, the well-being of conscious creatures as a foundation for ethics, the risk of unaligned artificial intelligence, how we're bad at predicting technological change, and many other topics. No paywall for this one. I think it's so important. As always, if you want to support what I'm doing here, you can subscribe to the podcast at samharris.org. And now I bring you Will MacAskill. I am back once again with the great Will MacAskill. Will, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back on.
So you are having a bit of a wild ride. You have a new book, and that book is What We Owe the Future. And I got a very early look at that. And it's really wonderful. And I don't think we'll cover all of it here, but we'll definitely get into it. But before we do that, I want to talk about effective altruism more generally, and in particular talk about some of the pushback I've noticed of late against it. And some of this echoes reservations I've had with the movement, and some of which we've discussed, and some of it strikes me as frankly crazy. So let's just get into that. But before we do, how are you doing? How's life?
I mean, things are very good overall. I definitely feel a little bit shell-shocked by the wave of attention I'm currently through, and I don't know, I'm alternating between excitement and anxiety, but overall it's very good indeed, and I'm happy these ideas are getting more airtime.
Am I right in thinking that I just saw EA and a long interview with you on the cover of Time magazine?
That's exactly right. So that was the news of the day. That came out this morning, and I think it's a beautiful piece by Nina Piper, and I'm probably read it to get a sense of what the EA movement's like.
That's great. Well, congratulations. I'm very happy to see that attention being bent your way, and perhaps we can bend more of it here. There's a lot we've already said about this, but I think we have to assume that many people in the audience have not heard the many hours you and I have gone round and round on these issues already. So at the top here, can you define a few terms? I think you should define effective altruism, what you mean, or you think we should mean by that phrase, and also long-termism and existential risk, because those will be coming up a lot here.
Sure. So effective altruism is a philosophy and a community that's about trying to ask the question, how can we do as much good as possible with our time and with our money? And then taking action to put the results of that, or answers to that question into practice, to try to make the world better. Long-termism is a philosophical perspective that says at least one of the key priorities of our time is to make the long-term future of humanity go well. That means just taking seriously just the sheer scale of the future, how high the stakes could be in shaping it, the fact that there really might be events that occur in our lifetimes that could have an enormous impact, for good or ill, in our own lifetimes, and taking seriously that we can help steer those events in a more positive direction, helping set humanity on a better path to improve the lives of our grandkids and their grandkids and their grandkids, and so on. Then the final term, existential risks, are a category of issues that I and others have increasingly focused on or started thinking and worrying about. And these are risks that could be enormously impactful, not just in the present, but in fact for the whole future. So some of these risks are risks that threaten extinction, such as the use of next generation bioweapons in World War III, with viruses of unprecedented lethality and infectiousness, could really result in the collapse of civilization or the extinction of everyone alive today in the worst case. Or very rapid advances in artificial intelligence, where that could result in, as you've argued, the AIs being just far more capable than human beings, such that the AI systems merely see humans as an obstacle to their goals. And we humans are disempowered in light of that, or in fact are, again, just made extinct or eliminated by such systems. Or existential risks can lead to permanent loss of value or future value, not just via extinction. So a perpetual dystopia that was, perhaps it's a little better than extinction, but not much better, with a lock-in of fascist values, that would count as an existential catastrophe as well. And increasingly, I've been getting to know the leading scientists who think that the scale of such existential catastrophe is actually not small. It's not like, in any way like this, 1 in a million chance of an asteroid strike in the next century, but much more like the risk of dying in a car crash in one's lifetime, where these risks are certainly in the multiple percentage points, maybe even tens of percentage points, just in our lifetime alone.
So in the definition of effective altruism, I think one could be forgiven for wondering what is novel about simply wanting to do as much good as one can, right? I mean, how is that a new contribution to the way we think about doing good in the world? Hasn't everyone who has attempted to do good wanted to do as much good as they could get their hands around? What do you view as being novel in this movement around that?
So I'm certainly not claiming that effective altruism is some radically new idea. I think you can see its intellectual roots going back decades. I actually argue you could see it going back 2,500 years to the first consequentialist and other philosophers, the mohists. But I actually think that this mindset of trying to do as much good as possible is at least somewhat unusual, where in general, when people try to do good, and this was certainly true for me before I started thinking about this, they are like looking at, what causes have been made salient to them, where in my case, that was extreme poverty. I remember as a teenager reading about how many people died of AIDS each year, and just thinking, oh my God, this is an atrocity. How can we not be taking more action on this? But what I wasn't doing at the time was sitting back, kind of taking a step back and thinking of all the things, all the many, many problems in the world. What's the thing that I should be most focusing on if I want to have the biggest impact I can? What's the best evidence? What are the best evidence saying about this? What are the best arguments saying about this? And really thinking that through. And so I actually think that mode of reasoning is somewhat unusual, and that's what's distinctive about effective altruism.
Yeah, so let's deal with some of this pushback before moving on. I'm sure there's been much more that I haven't noticed, but in the last few days I noticed a Wall Street Journal article that really did not have much substance to it. It seems to have been written by someone who just doesn't like paying taxes and didn't seem to like Sam Bankman-Fried's politics. I didn't really detect any deep arguments against effective altruism there. I guess there's one salient point was that creating economic value, i.e. doing business, is generally the best way to help people at scale and reduce unnecessary suffering. And I guess I think we could easily concede that insofar as that's true, and wherever it happens to be true, it would be very easy for us to say, okay, well then, sure, let business solve our problems. And so there's, and I don't think you would resist that conclusion wherever it's true. I mean, I think one could certainly argue that someone like Elon Musk, by building desirable electric cars, has done, if not more good, a different species of good than many forms of environmental activism have to move us away from a climate change catastrophe. So, if that's true, I mean, let's bracket that, and it's hard to know what exactly is true there, but I certainly have an intuition that there's a place for business, and even a majority place for business, to affect our climate outcome, and that it might be greater than charity. He seemed to think that was a real, some kind of coup de grace against effective altruism and even philanthropy in general. But I think that blow just passes right by us, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the thing that I'll say that's the claim from that criticism is that in some circumstances, markets can be extremely good ways of allocating resources. So take the problem of people having access to the internet and to computing technology in the United States, at least the people who are middle class. Then, businesses are dealing with that at least relatively well. There's great incentives to give this product that are benefiting people are willing to pay for it, and there aren't kind of major externalities. However, as has been well known in economics for, I think, 100 years now, there are very many cases where markets don't produce the ideal social outcome, which they call externalities. So take the case of climate change, which is, absolute paradigm of this example, where if someone mines coal and burns it, that can be good for them because they're creating energy, but it has this negative effect on third parties. that were not kind of privy to that decision. They had no influence over it because it warms the climate and it makes those third parties work worse off. And so the standard solution then, and this is endorsed by economists on the right as well as the left, it's just uncontroversial, is that you want some amount of government involvement there, at least in the form of taxation. So putting a tax on carbon. There's other things you can do as well, but that's the one way, in order to guide market behavior to better outcomes. However, I would go further than this as well and say, there are not only cases of market failure, there are also cases of democratic failure as well, where if you consider the extreme poor who are living in a country with poor political institutions, perhaps even a dictatorship, they do not have democratic say over the policies that rich countries like the UK and the US are enacting. And so they will not be given adequate representation, neither in the market nor in political decision-making. Or if we look at non-human animals, they have no say at all. Or if we look at future people, those who will be born not now, but in the generations to come, they have no say over, they have no participation in the market. They have no influence there. They have no say in political decision-making either. And so it's no surprise, I think, that their interests are systematically neglected. And we have no guarantee at all that kind of business as usual for the world would lead to the best outcomes possible for them.
Yeah. Okay, so then there was this article I noticed in this online journal, maybe it's also a print journal, called Current Affairs, which I hesitate to mention because the editor over there strikes me as someone who's truly mentally unwell, given some of the insane things he's written about me and the length at which he's written them. But this article was not written by him, written by somebody else, raised some points that I think are valid, as well as many that weren't. And the valid ones are around the issue of how we think about expected value and kind of a probability calculus over various possibilities in the future. And this is really integral to your new book and how we think about safeguarding the future. So I think, before we dive into your thesis proper, let's talk about the concept of prioritizing to whatever degree the well-being of people who don't yet exist. When people say, we should prioritize the future to some significant degree, it's very easy for them to do this by reference to their children, whether you're young people who currently exist and have no control over anything. That's easy to see. But when you're talking about the hypothetical billions and trillions of a future humanity that may thrive or not even exist, depending on how we play our cards at this moment, I think people's moral intuitions begin to fall apart. And the most extreme case of the problem here is if you try to run any kind of utility function based on a straightforward calculation of probabilities, if you say, if I could just reduce the risk that we will be wiped out by some catastrophic event, let's say a global pandemic, but if I could reduce that by even 1 in a million, given the fact that we have trillions upon trillions of potential lives on that side of the balance, then that's more important than anything I could do now, including saving the lives of identifiable people, even thousands of identifiable people. And then that's what people do. That's something that's simply gone wrong here in how we're thinking about human well-being. So
Sure, I'm so glad you brought up, because this is a framing that often gets mentioned, and I think it's really unfortunate. And I want to push against it in the strongest possible terms, where if it were the case that the argument for concern and serious concern about how we might impact future generations rested on these vanishingly small probabilities of enormous amounts of value, then I wouldn't be writing this book. I would be doing other things. And I don't think it does. And the reason this framing came up is because in academic articles, Nick Bostrom, who I believe you've had on, he sketched out what are the implications of a very particular moral view, expectational total utilitarianism. And he said, if you're taking this view seriously, then that's the conclusion you get. What he wasn't saying was that we should endorse that conclusion. In fact, he and essentially everyone I know, at least in practice outside of the ivory tower, take that as a reductio rather than an implication. So Nick himself is not a consequentialist even, and wrote other papers on this idea of Pascal's mugging. So it's similar like Pascal's wager, but just without infinite stakes, where these tiny probabilities of huge amounts of value, it doesn't seem like you just do the math and multiply that.
Can you actually describe the Pascal's mugging example?
Sure, I'm happy to. And so the idea is just, you've had a nice time at the pub, you walk outside, a man comes up to you and says, "Give me your wallet." You say no, and he says, "Okay, fair. If you give me the contents of your wallet, let's say that's $100, I, tomorrow, will come back and I will give you any finite amount of well-being. So just whatever amount of well-being you ask for, I will give you it. And you say, no, I just think I'm certain that that's not going to happen. And the man says, come on, you're not certain, are you? Look at my eyes, I've got this pale complexion, I look a bit, it's possible that I'm this, traveler from the future, or this alien with amazing powers, or I'm some sort of god. It's possible. Maybe it's a 1 in a billion that I will be able to do this. But it's at least possible. And you take that 1 in a billion, multiply it by a sufficiently large amount of well-being for you. That, in what decision theorists call expected value, which is where you take the probability of an outcome and the value of that outcome and multiply them together to get the expected value. That expected value is greater than that £100 for you. And then maybe you say, oh yeah, that's okay, I guess that seems correct, you hand over the £100. And now what Washington thinks, and what almost everyone who works on this thinks, is that that's absurd. That if you got a model, if you got a decision theory, it's actually not about morality, it's about the theory of that. If you've got decision theory that says you should give the wallet to the mother, then something has gone badly wrong. And one way that I like to illustrate this, and this applies to and this problem gets called the fanaticism problem. And it's a really interesting area of decision theory because I actually think it's the strongest argument against a theory that's otherwise very good, which is expected value theory. But seeing one way of this going wrong is if this argument is used for giving the money to the mugger, or for, looking for future amounts of value, even if it were just 1 in a billion chance to change it. Well, why are you going after only finite amounts of value? There's a long religious tradition that says you can get infinite amounts of value via heaven. And so really the upshot, if you're taking expected value theory seriously, is to become a missionary, to try and ensure that you get into as many heavens as possible according to as many different forms of religious belief as possible, and try and convince others to do the same. And that's where expected value theory, if you're really going with the math and doing it, takes you. And I know of 0 people who have done that. Everyone says, look, okay, something, we don't know what. I think this is an incredibly hard area within decision theory. We don't know what the right answer is, but it's not that. And the argument for concern about the long-term future is the fact that these risks are more like the risks of dying in a car crash, and much less like the 1 in a billion Pascal mother kind of risk.
Well, admittedly, this is a problem I have not thought much about, but I have a couple of intuitions here kindling as I listen to you describe it. I mean, one is that obviously expected value becomes eminently rational within the domain of normal probabilities. I mean, it works in poker, it works in any kind of decision analysis where you're just trying to figure out what you should do under uncertainty, and you're dealing with probabilities of 1/3 or 10%, or that is how we organize our intuitions about the future in the most systematic way. And I guess there are even corner conditions within the domain of normal probabilities where you basically, this is not a repeated game. You've got one shot to take this risk, and it may be that risking your life, whatever you put on the other side of the scale, doesn't make sense, except we don't live that way. We risk our lives every time we get into a car, get on a plane, or ride a bike. We've all made the trade-offs whether we've actually done decision analysis or not, consciously assigned probabilities or not. We just have a vague sense that certain types of risks are acceptable. I think that's my other intuition, is that this is somewhat analogous to the problems disgorged by population ethics, where when we talk about things like the repugnant conclusion, and you're sort of talking about very large numbers of very small things, or very small utility, you seem to get these grotesque outcomes ethically. Where do you think this is breaking down? Why do you think it's breaking down?
So the standard response within decision theory would be to have what's... so it all gets technical quickly, and I apologize if I don't do a good job of explaining the idea. But the standard response is to have what's called a bounded value function. And it's easiest to see this when it comes to money, let's say. So if the mugger in Pascal's mugging was saying, okay, I will take £100 off you today, and I will come back tomorrow with any finite amount of money you like that you can spend on yourself. Let's just assume you're completely self-interested, to keep it simple. I could say, look, my probability of you coming back is so low that there is no amount of money that you could give me such that the probability times that amount of money would add up to more expected well-being for me than £100 now. So let's say I think it's 1 in a billion that the mugger will come back. Okay, sure. The mugger could give me $1,000 billion, and that would mean more. I would have greater expected financial returns. However, I wouldn't have greater expected well-being. The more money I have, the less it impacts my well-being. And there's only so much that money can buy things. At some point, it starts making this vanishingly small difference, such that there's a level of well-being such that I can't get 1,000 times greater well-being with any amount more money. And so that's very clear when it comes to financial returns. But you might think the same thing happens with well-being. So supposing I have the best possible life, just peaks of bliss and enjoyment and amazing relationships and creative insight over and over, and that's for some very, very long-lived life. Perhaps you just imagine that. Now you might think, oh, it's just not possible to have a life that's 1,000 times better than that life we've just imagined. And in fact, I think that's how people do in fact reason. So even if you'd say to someone, look, you can have a 50-50 chance. You either die now or you get to live for as long as you like and choose when you pass away. I think most people don't take that bet. And that suggests that we actually think that perhaps there's expectations with very long lives, but we can reformulate the thought. Either way, I think people just do think there's just an upper bound to how good a life could be. And as soon as you've accepted that, then in the self-interest case, you can very readily avoid this kind of Pascal's mugging or Pascal's wager situation. And perhaps you can make the same move when it comes to moral value as well, where you're ultimately saying, there's a limit to how good the world or the universe can be. And as soon as you've got that, then you avoid Pascal's mugging, you avoid Pascal's wager. However, you do get into other problems, so that's sobering.
Yeah, the thing that I think is especially novel about what you've been doing, about EA in general, which I always tend to emphasize in this conversation. I think I've brought this up with you many times before, but its novelty has not faded for me. And here's a non-novel part about which someone could be somewhat cynical. It's just the basic recognition that some charities are much more effective than others, and we should want to know which are which and prioritize our resources accordingly. I mean, that's the effective part of effective altruism. That's great, and that's not what has captivated me about this. I think that the thing that is most interesting to me is by prioritizing effectiveness in an unsentimental way, what you've done for me is you've uncoupled the ethics of what we're doing from positive psychology. Really just divorcing the question of how I can do the most good from the question of what I find to be most rewarding about doing good in the world. I'm always tempted to figure out how to marry them more and more, because I think that'll be the most motivating and, by definition, the most rewarding way to live. But I'm truly agnostic as to how married they might be. And when I survey my own experience, I notice they're really not married at all. And for instance, over at Waking Up, we launched this campaign, which we've called 100 Days of Giving. And, so for 100 days, we're giving $10,000 a day to various charities, and we're having subscribers over at Waking Up decide which charities among the list that you and friends have helped me vet. So every single day, we're giving $10,000 away to some great cause, and we're about 30 days into this campaign. And honestly, I think for most of those 30 days, I have not thought about it at all, right? I mean, literally, it has not even been a 10-second memory on any given day. And, I consider that on some level a feature rather than a bug, but it is striking to me that, in terms of my own personal well-being and my own sense of connection to the well-being of others, I might actually be more rewarded. In fact, I think I'm almost guaranteed to be more rewarded by simply holding the door open for someone walking into a coffee shop later this afternoon and just having a moment of, a smile, right? Like that absolutely trivial moment of good feeling will be more salient to me than the $10,000 we're giving today and tomorrow and the next day and onward, for months. So I'm just wondering what you do with that. I mean, it's a bug and a feature. It's a feature because I really do think this is how you do the most good. You automate these things, you decide rationally what you want to do, and you put that in place, and then it's no longer vulnerable to the vagaries of your own moral intuitions, or you getting captivated by some other bright, shiny object and forgetting about all the good you intended to do. But I do hold out some hope that we can actually draw our feelings of well-being more and more directly from the actual good we're accomplishing in the world. And I just think there's just more to think about on the front of how to accomplish that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's an old chestnut, but it's true that our psychology, human psychology, did not evolve to respond to the modern world. It evolved for the ancestral environment. Our community, the people that we could affect, amounted to the dozens of people, perhaps. Certainly the idea that you could impact someone on the other side of the world or in generations to come, that was not true in the way it's true today. And so we have a radical misalignment between the moral sentiments that we have evolved and the moral reality that we face today. And so one thing, there's this project that effective altruism as a community has tried to embark on to some extent, which is just trying to align those two things a little bit better. And it's tough because we're not fundamentally aligned. But the ideal circumstance is where you are part of a community where you can get reward and support and reassurance for doing the thing that actually helps other people the most, rather than the one where you get that immediate kind of warm glow. And that's not to say you shouldn't do those things too. I certainly do, and I think it's part of living a good, well-rounded life. But it's just a fact that there are people in very poor countries who are dying of easily preventable diseases. We can take action to help them. There are animals suffering greatly on factory farms. We can take actions to alleviate that suffering. There are risks that are maybe going to affect the entire fate of the planet, as well as killing billions of people in the present generation. That is not something that my monkey brain is equipped to deal with. And so, we've got to try as best we can. And that's something, at least for me, where having a community of people who share this idea, who I can talk these ideas through with, and who can, if needed, if I find these things hard, provide support and reassurance, that's at least a partial solution to this problem, to get my monkey brain to care more about the things that really matter.
Well, so are there any other problems that have been, that you've noticed or that have been raised by EA's critics that you think we should touch on before we jump into the book and this discussion of long-termism and existential risk?
Sure. I think the number one thing that is in some sense a problem, but I think is just kind of where the debate should be, is just what follows from long-termism, where the thoughts that I want to promote and get out into the world are that future people count. There could be enormous numbers of them, and we really can, and in fact are, impacting how their lives go. And then there's this second question of, well, what do we do about that? What's the top priorities for the world today? Is that the standard environmentalist answer of mitigate climate change, reduce resource depletion, reduce species loss? Is it the classic existential risk answer of reduce the risk of misaligned AI, reduce the risk of a worst-case pandemic? Is it the idea of just promoting better values? Is it something that I think you're sympathetic to, and others like Tyler Cohen and Patrick Collison are sympathetic to, which is just generally make the world saner and more well-functioning, because predicting the future is so hard? Or is it perhaps about just trying to put the next generation into a situation such that they can make a better and more informed decision and have at least the option to decide kind of how their future will go? These are extremely hard questions. And, I actively want to see an enormous amount of debate on what follows from that. Perhaps 1,000 times as much work as has gone into it. I would love to see discussing these issues. And these are hard. There's an enormous amount to say. And so that's where I think the kind of real meat of debate lies.
Okay, so let's talk about the book, because you spoke a couple of minutes ago about how we are misaligned in psychological terms by virtue of imperfect evolution to think about problems at scale, and that's certainly true, but we have made impressive progress with respect to scaling our concern about our fellow human beings over physical distance. Distance with respect to space, we kind of understand ethically now. I mean, Peter Singer has done a lot of work on this topic, urging us to expand the circle of our moral concern, and I think something like 100% of the people listening to us will understand that you can't be a good person and say that you only care about people who live within 1,000 miles of your home, right? I mean, that's just not compatible with life in the 21st century. Although there's some discounting function, no doubt, and I think normal psychology would cause us to care more about family and friends than about perfect strangers, and certainly perfect strangers in faraway cultures for which we have no affinity, etc. And I think we've discussed this in previous conversations, just what might be normative there, whether we actually would want perfect indifference and dispassion with respect to all those variables, or if there's some hierarchy of concern that's still appropriate. And I think it probably is. But the topic of today's conversation and of your book is just how abysmally we have failed to generate strong intuitions about the moral responsibility we have and the moral opportunity we have to safeguard the future. So perhaps you can, with that setup, you can give me the elevator synopsis of the new book.
Sure. So, like I said, this book is about long-termism, about just taking seriously the future that's ahead of us, taking seriously the moral value that future generations have, and then also taking seriously the fact that what we do as a society really will impact the very long term. And I think there are two categories of things that impact the very long term, where there's things that could just end civilization altogether. And this concern really got on society's radar with the advent of nuclear weapons. I think an all-out nuclear war, I think, unlikely to kill literally everybody, but it could result in it would result in hundreds of millions, maybe even billions deaths, unimaginable costs, which I think would make the world worse, not just for those people, but for the extremely long time, and could result in a collapse of civilization too. At the more extreme level, there's worries about, in particular, engineered pandemics. And this is a risk that we've been worrying about for many years now, where pandemics occur occasionally and are extremely bad. And so society doesn't prepare for them in the way they should. I think the risk is going to get much worse over time, because not only do we have to contend with natural pandemics, we will also have to contend with pandemics from viruses that have been enhanced to have more destructive properties, or even just created de novo, such as in a bioweapons program. This is a very scary prospect, and current estimates put the risk of all-out catastrophe something like 1%. A second kind of set of events that could impact the very long term are things that don't impact the length of civilization, that is, it wouldn't kill us off early, but does affect the value of that civilization, kind of civilization's quality of life, as it were. And in What We Are the Future, I focus in particular on values, where we're used to values changing an enormous amount over time. But that's actually something that I think is contingent about our world. And I think there are ways, especially via technological and political developments, that change could slow. And in the worst case, our future could be one of perpetual totalitarian dictatorship. That would be very scary indeed. That would be a loss of almost all value that we could have, an existential risk itself, even if that civilization were very long-lived. And so what can we do? And things vary in terms of how practical they are, like how much there is actually to do. But there are many things I think we can do. So on the ensuring we have a future side of things, I actually think that there's very concrete actions we can take to reduce the risk of the next pandemic, such as technology to monitor wastewater for new pathogens, such as there's this new form of lighting called far UVC that I'm extremely excited about. If we can get the cost down enough, then we can just be sterilizing rooms in an ongoing way, in a way that's not harmful for human health. Or, on the values kind of side of things, well, we can be pushing for people to be more altruistic, more reasonable in the way they think about moral matters. Perhaps more impartial too, taking seriously the interests of all sentient beings, whether they're human or animal or other, or whether they're now or in the future. And we can be kind of guarding against like certain authoritarian tendencies that are very common, and we have seen in history over and over again, and that's quite scary from a long-term perspective. And then lastly, we can just start reasoning more about this. I said earlier that, I don't know, I'm not super confident about what we should be doing, but certainly we can be doing more investigation, building a movement that takes seriously, there's this enormous potential future ahead of us, and we can do an enormous amount of good to make it happen.
Yeah, I want to talk about value lock-in and some of the issues there. But before we get there, I think we should linger on what makes thinking about the future so difficult. I think you say somewhere in the book that, both with respect to distance in space and distance in time, I think you say something like we mistake distance for unreality, right? Like the fact that something is far away from us makes part of our brain suspect that it may not quite exist. And this is, again, I think this has changed fairly categorically with respect to space, where you just can't really imagine that the people suffering over in Yemen don't exist. But it's much harder to assimilate this new intuition with respect to time, because in this case we are talking about people who don't actually exist. There'll be some number of thousands of people, probably 3,000 to 5,000 people or so, born over the course of our having this conversation, right, globally speaking.
Yeah.
I think the math is somewhere around there. And so it's easy to argue, okay, these are people who are coming into this world for which they have no responsibility. And we, the present generation or generations, are entirely responsible for the quality of the world they inherit and the quality of the lives they begin to lead. And I would say we don't, collectively, we don't think nearly enough about that responsibility. But when you're talking about people who may or may not be born in some distant future, we don't think about these people at all. And I suspect that most people wouldn't see any problem with that, because it's just, when you think about what a crime it would be for us to foreclose the future in some way. If we all die in our sleep tonight painlessly and there is no human future, what's bad about that? Well, you have to tell yourself a story about all the unrealized joy and happiness and creativity that exists in potentia on that side of the ledger. But there are no victims deprived of all of that goodness because they don't exist, right? So this is the very essence of a victimless crime. And I think you and I have touched that issue in previous conversations. But it's just hard to think about the far future, much less prioritize it. And I'm just wondering if there's something we can do to shore up our intuitions here. The first point I would make is that the only reason why these people are hypothetical is because you, the listener, are holding out some possibility that they may not exist. When you ask yourself, what would cause subsequent future generations of people not to exist? Perhaps there's some other version, but the only thing I can imagine is some catastrophe of the sort that you've begun sketching out, right? Some pandemic, some asteroid impact, some nuclear war, some combination of those things that destroy everything for everyone, which is to say some absolutely horrific cataclysm, which we should be highly motivated to avoid, right? So if we successfully avoid the worst possible outcome for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, the future people we're talking about are guaranteed to exist. It's only time shifted. It's not, in fact, in question. And the only thing that would put it in question is some horrific outcome that we are responsible for foreseeing and avoiding. And really, there's no one else to do the job.
Absolutely. There's this general issue where why do we care about people on the other side of the planet much more now than we did 100 years ago? And it's clear that a big part of it is that now we can see people on the other side of the world. We get information in a way that we never used to, where literally there can be a live stream video of someone in Nigeria or Pakistan or India or any other country around the world. So that, those people's lives become vivid to us in a way that's just not possible for future generations. And that makes the challenge just so deep that to get good care. If there were news from the future, the newspaper of tomorrow, I think we wouldn't be in such a bad state. We could report on what the world is like in the year 2100 or 2200. And I think people would care. But that's not the news we get. It's all abstract, and that's really tough. The thing I'll say is, you mentioned the idea of some capacity just painlessly killed all of us in our sleep. And, what would that be a tragedy? And I think yes, and I argue in the book at length that it would be a tragedy. Both because I think that we should expect the future to be on balance good, and secondly because I think the loss of lives at least sufficiently good. And certainly the loss of all the moral and artistic and technological progress that we might see in the future, that those are great losses. But I want to emphasize the case for long-termism does not rely on that. You could think that everyone dying painlessly in their sleep would not be a bad thing, morally speaking. Nonetheless, a future perpetual totalitarian dictatorship really would be compared to a wonderful, free, thriving, liberal future where different people can pursue their visions of the good, and we've eradicated issues that plague today like injustice and poverty. I just think you really don't need to engage in much moral philosophy to say that if we have a choice between one or the other, then it's better, and much better to think about the thriving, flourishing future than this dystopian.
Yeah, that's a great point. We forget about the thought experiments. It should be pretty easy to acknowledge that there's a difference between having to live under the 1,000-year Reich and living under some version of the best possible solution to the problem of global civilization. Is there anything more to say about just the abstract about the significance of the future? I guess I'm wondering if you've thought at all about how because again, it's surprising that I think we think about this almost not at all, and yet our assumptions about it do a lot of psychological work for us. I really, this is my job to have conversations like this, and I'm surprised at how little I think about the far future, right, in any kind of significant way. And yet if I imagine how I would feel if I knew that it wouldn't exist, right? If we just figured out that, actually, the whole story ends in 80 years, right? So we're unlikely to be around to suffer much, or we're going to be out of the game pretty soon. And, people haven't had kids, don't need to worry about them. And so just the basic picture is just the career of the species is radically foreclosed at some point inside of a century. What would that do to everything? And how would that sap the meaning from what we do? It's an interesting question, which I haven't thought much about, but do you have any intuitions about that?
It's a great thought experiment, and it's represented in this film, Children's Men, where global population is sterile. And it's discussed at length in the writings of philosopher Samuel Beckett, in the Death and the Afterlife. And he argues that if it were the case that there's no world at all, let's say past our generation, or even our children's generation, it would sap enormous amounts of, in fact, perhaps most meaning from our lives. This was actually a point made by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, where he briefly had this phase of being concerned by concentrations, arguing actually that means they should be keeping coal in the ground, which I think wasn't quite right. Maybe made sense given their views at the time or something, but their views were incorrect. But he has this beautiful speech to Parliament, and he has this wonderful line: "Why should we care about posterity? After all, what has posterity ever done for us?" And he goes on to argue that actually, posterity has done an enormous amount for us because it gives our projects meaning. Where we plant trees that future generations will sit under. We build cathedrals that are like a testament to our time and can be recognized by future generations. When we engage in activities like moral progress and political progress and scientific and technological progress, part of how we have meaning in doing those things is because it's like we're part of this grand relay race where we have taken the baton from previous generations, the things they did badly and the things they did well, and we can hand that baton on to future generations, making the world a little bit better, giving them a little bit of a higher platform to stand on. And yeah, I think this is just a very widely shared view, and I think it kind of resonates with me intuitively too, where if I found out that everything was going to end in 50 years, I wouldn't be like, oh well, I guess I'll just focus on issues that just concern the near term. Then I would be devastated, even if that didn't personally affect anyone I knew, or perhaps it's not 50 years, perhaps it's 200 years. Nonetheless, I would be absolutely devastated.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's not something that I've ever been aware of, but it is an integral piece of how I think about what we're doing here, which is when you think about human progress, you think about all the good things we do and all the bad things we can avoid. The idea that is all going to be brought up short in a few short years, right? We just think of what's the point of building increasingly wonderful and powerful and benign technology, or creating beautiful art or literature, or making progress on any front, philosophically. I mean, beyond just securing your day-to-day comfort and basic happiness, there's something forward-leaning about all of that. It's a check that, in some sense, never gets cashed or fully cashed, or it just gets continually cashed in the future, if not by our future selves, by others who are still connected. And the idea that we could ever know that a few more years of this and then it's all over, I mean, we all know that personally with respect to our own mortality, but there is something about the open-endedness of the whole project for others, even if you don't have kids, that changes. Again, I really don't even have, my intuitions around this are so unformed, but it really does feel like it changes something about day-to-day life. If the rug were truly pulled out from under us in a way that we had to acknowledge, leaving everything else intact, right? I mean, all the buildings are still standing. There's still a concert Saturday night in the same auditorium, and you have tickets, but you knew the world was going to end, and you were just going to get a collective dial tone at some point in the near future. I don't know to what degree, but it would change everything to some degree.
So in what year of the future, I actually start and end the book on the same note, the note of death, where the book is dedicated to my parents, Maya and Robin, and their parents, Nina, Frank and Beth, and so on, all the way back, all the history that led us here. And at the very end of the book, in the very last page, in the print version, there's this QR code, and if you scan it, it takes you to this little short story I wrote. I'm not claiming it's any good, but I did it because I think it's so hard to visualize the future, especially to visualize how good the future could be. And in the end of that short story, one of the characters reflects on everything that led, this depiction of this, I'm not saying the best possible future, but at least a good one. And one of the characters just reflects on just everything that led to her life today. all of the hardships, the ways of the past in which people endured sickness and suffering and rides on the subway packed in with other people who are, miserable in their community, and just being deeply thankful for all of that. And that's certainly how I feel, where, the past generations have given us this mixed bag. They've given us many ways in which the world is broken, many ways in which we still see enormous suffering. But they've also given us wonderful, good things too. I live in this liberal, democratic country that is exceptionally unusual by historical standards. I don't need to suffer pain when I engage in a surgery. I don't need to risk for my life in diseases like syphilis or tuberculosis. I can see the pain just on my phone and just see the most wonderful parts of the world at any time. I can see the world. I can go traveling, like India, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia. Wow, I'm just so grateful for all that's been done. The very least that I can do is try and take that mixed package of goods and bads, and try and pass it to try and ensure that even our future generations that I can pass it to, but also to make it better. And so that's kind of, normally I trade in these like logical or rational arguments, but at least in terms of what motivates me on a gut level, that's the significant.
So we have something like 500 million to 1.3 billion good years left on this planet, if the behavior of our sun is an indication. So the challenge here is to not screw it up, and we may decide the possibility of reaching for the stars, which we will certainly do if we don't screw things up, and spreading out across the galaxy. But even on this lowly planet, we have an extraordinary amount of time to make things better and better. And we're just at the point where we can get our hands around the kinds of things that could ruin everything and not of our own making, like asteroid impacts and naturally spawned pandemics. And there's clear ways in which our time is unusual. I think in the book we discuss how for virtually all of the past we were culturally isolated from one another, and we may one day be again culturally isolated if we expand out across the galaxy, which is to say that there will be a time in the future where human communities grow far enough apart that what they do has really no implication for what anyone else does outside of their community, and that was true of most of human history until recent centuries. I think there's a more fundamental claim in your book, which is that there's good reason to believe that we are at something like a hinge moment in history where the things we do and don't do have an outsized effect on the trajectory of human life in the future, and things that come up recently like value walking, which are related to that, which we'll talk about. But what do you think about this question of whether or not we're living at a hinge moment, and how we can know and how we may or may not be mistaken about that?
I think it's clear that we're living at an extremely unusual time that gives a good argument for thinking that we're living at an unusually impactful time too. And I'm not going to claim we're living at the most unusual time or impactful time in history. Perhaps the next century will be even more influential again. But it's certainly very easy. And the core reason for this is just kind of think about the tree of technology that civilization can kind of go through from. At the very first stage, there's twin taxes and spear throwers and fire and the wheel. And then nowadays, maybe it's fusion technology and advanced machine learning, biotechnology that are current developments. And at some point, there will be future technology that perhaps we've not even imagined yet. Here's the question, just relative to both the past and the future, how quickly are we moving through that technology? And I think there's very good arguments for thinking that it's much faster. We are moving much faster through that technology than for almost all of human history and almost all of the future, if we don't go extinct in the near term. And I think that's clear. So economists measure this generally with economic growth, where at least a significant fraction of economic growth comes from technological progress. And the economy is currently growing far, far faster than it has done for almost all of human history, where today the economy doubles every 20 years or so.
Yeah, so it's growing around 2% or so, and compounding
Exactly.
that, it could be a doubling time of something like 25 years or
Exactly.
thereabouts.
Yeah, 2-3%. When we were hunter-gatherers, growth was very close to zero. As farmers, growth was more like 0.1%, so a doubling every few hundred years or so. And so relative to the past, we are speeding through technological development much faster than before. For most of human history before, honestly, I say before the scientific industrial revolution, really it's before about the year 1900, so it was a slower kind of ramp up. But then secondly, I think we're speeding through that progress much faster than for most of the future too. And the argument for this is that they'll just assume we keep growing at about 2% per year for another 10,000 years. How much growth would there have to be in that case? Well, it turns out, because of the power of compound growth, that it would mean that for every atom within reach, that is within 10,000 light years, there would be, I think it's 100 billion trillion current civilizations worth of atoms. And now, maybe that's possible. I think it's extremely unlikely. And so I think at some point, with this level of progress, of economic and technological progress, we would get very close to basically discovering almost everything that is to discover on the order of a few thousand years. However, as you said, there are hundreds of millions of years to go, potentially. And so that means that, as I said, we're moving particularly quickly through the tree of technology. And every technology comes with its distribution of powers and capabilities and benefits and disadvantages. So if we take the ability to harness energy from the atom, well, that gives us clean energy. It gave bionuclear power. That's an enormous benefit to society. It also gave us nuclear weapons that could threaten wars more destructive than any we've ever seen in history. And I think future technologies, such as biotechnology that can, allow us to create new viruses, or advanced artificial intelligence, that each one of these give us this new distribution of powers. And some of those powers can have extraordinarily long-lasting impacts, such as the power of space, or such as the power of lock in particular narrow ideological borders. And that's why the Earth is such a crucial moment.
Yeah, the principle of compounding has other relevance here. Some question of just how influential a moment this might be in history. It's when you just look at how effects of any kind compound over time, it does cast back upon the present inordinate responsibility to safeguard the future, because we have this enormous potential influence. The slightest reflection of the trajectory potentially has massive implications, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And it's obviously hard to do the math on these things. It's hard to predict the full set of consequences from any change we make. But if you just look at what it means to steadily diminish the probability of a full-scale nuclear war year after year, even just by, 2% a year, if we could just get that virtuous compounding to happen, you roll that same logic to every other problem you care about, it's very easy to see that getting our act together, however incrementally now on all these fronts, matters enormously in the not-too-distant future.
Absolutely. I mean, my colleague Toby Ord in his wonderful book, The Precipice, just suggests that, well, what's happening now is that our technology is advancing more rapidly than our wisdom. And it's a beautiful idea. And what we're trying to do is accelerate wisdom. We're trying to just make us a little bit wiser, a little bit more cognizant of, there's most people fall into one of two camps. There are the people who are really into technology, the kind of stereotype of the Silicon Valley people, and they think technology is great and we just need to keep advancing it. And then there are the people who are not really into technology, and the people who are very skeptical of Silicon Valley and worry about what technology could be doing to society. And I think I just really want people to inhabit both frames of mind at once. Technology has benefits and costs. Some technologies are just like anesthetic. I'm like, oh yeah, that's just really good. Let's have more of these no downside, unashamedly good technologies. Let's speed them up faster. For technologies that are very dual use, or just extremely powerful and we don't know how to handle them, well, let's then be careful and considerate about how we're developing these technologies, have good norms and regulations in place, so that we don't, basically just walk backwards into a chasm where we wreak global disaster because we're not even paying attention to the impact that technologies that are just around the corner will have, because of this reason of out of sight and out of mind, because we're barely thinking about, we barely think about like the end of the next year, certainly not the end of the next political cycle, let alone the decades ahead that could bring about radical changes and how they might impact the centuries ahead.
Well, simply by uttering the phrase political cycle, you have referenced what I consider a major problem here, which is we have a politics that is almost by definition a machine of short-termism, whereas it's taking a long-term view is antithetical to the whole project of becoming president and staying president and then raising money for your next campaign. I mean, you're just not and to speak specifically of America at this point, I don't know that it's much better in any other country. You're not incentivized to think about the far future and to figure out how to help all those people whose names you will never know and who will never vote for you, much less give you money. It's just not in the cards, right? And so one thing that has to be a fairly high priority is to figure out how to engineer a system of political and economic incentives such that we more effortlessly take the future into account.
Absolutely. And honestly, it's extremely tough. So I've worked on this topic. I have an article on long-termist political institutions with another philosopher, Tyler John. And there are some things you can do, such as, some countries have an ombudsperson to represent future generations. I'm particularly attracted to the idea of at least an advisory body, a kind of citizens' assembly, so a randomly selected group of people from the populace who are explicitly given the task of representing the interests of future generations and then making recommendations about what the government could do differently in order to make the future go better. I think we can also build in just more information, so more think tanks or quasi-governmental organizations that have the task of really trying to project not just the next few years, but the next few decades, even the next few centuries. These are some changes we can make. However, the fundamental problem is that future generations are being impacted without representation. They do not get a vote. And the fundamental problem is we cannot give them a vote. There's no way they can represent themselves. And what do we do about that? Honestly, I think it's going to be very hard to make major progress unless there's some significant cultural change. So if we imagine a world where governments are responding to the views and preferences and ideals of their populace, of the electorate, and that electorate cares about the long term, well, that's a situation where we can align political incentives with the long-term good. And so that's what I think we really need to get to.
I mean, it's just amazing how hard it is, even for normal people who have children, to prioritize the next decade, right? I mean, even so, a decade where they have every expectation of being alive and suffering the consequences of our present actions, and they have certainly every expectation that their children will be alive in those decades. When you look at a problem like climate change or anything else that is slowish moving and has various features like being in part a tragedy of the commons, running counter to any individual's personal economic incentives, etc. It all falls by the wayside, even when you're not talking about hypothetical people who you will never meet, right? I mean, it's just there's something so hard about focusing on the big picture. And so, yeah, it does. I mean, when you talk about cultural change, it's hard to see the thing that would be so sweeping that it would capture more or less everybody all at once. But perhaps that's not even the right goal. I mean, maybe there are only something like 5,000 people whose minds would have to change to fundamentally redirect human energy. I mean, this is an elitist claim and argument, but I suspect that something like that might also be true.
Yeah, I think I'm more optimistic on this in general than you are, where, in the course of doing research for what we'll keep that, I dug a lot into the history of various social and moral movements, such as environmentalism, feminism, animal welfare movement, and in particular, the abolition of slavery. Yeah. And one thing I think it's easy to underestimate is just how weird these ideas were in the past, at least in particular for the political elite, or at least the people in power, where you don't have to go that long ago. Let's just focus on the environmentalist movement. I think there's many analogies here where the environment can't represent itself. It has an advantage that you can see the environment, you can relate to it. But 150 years ago, concern for the environment was really not on the table. Maybe you had poets, William Wordsworth, starting to cultivate love for nature, but there just really wasn't anything like a movement. Whereas now, it is just a part of common sense morality, at least in many countries around the world. That is, by historical standards, that is amazingly remarkable, amazingly rapid moral change. And so, at least if we're able to say, look, we're not going to be able to make this change to convince everyone of this long-term outlook, convince everyone of having concern for future generations. We're not going to be able to convince them within the next few years or even a few decades. But when we look 100 years out, maybe we can. Maybe actually we really can affect that sort of sweeping moral change where concern for future generations is just on the same level as concern for other people in the community or people of different ethnicities than you. I'm holding out hope.
I'm holding out hope that those sirens aren't people coming to arrest you for your thought crimes.
I'm sorry, this is I'm in New York for the book.
Are you recording this podcast while robbing a bank?
Look, it's for the greater good, right? The money can go further. So that's don't do that. Just in case my followers take me too literally.
Let's go on record. We're against bank robbery, at least currently.
I'm with that.
I won't say anything about value lock-in on that point, but let's talk about this issue of value lock-in and what you call moments of plasticity and trajectory changes. How do you think about, and you might want to define some of those terms, but what is the issue and opportunity here?
Sure. So at the moment, there's a wide diversity of model views in the world and rapid model change. So the gay rights movement can build in power and momentum in the 60s and 70s, and then you get legalization of gay marriage a few decades later. Clear example of positive model change. And so we're very used to that. We think it's kind of just part of reality. We wouldn't expect that might change in the future, such that model change might come to an end. The idea of value lock-in is taken seriously, but maybe it will actually. Maybe model progress will stall. And so value lock-in is the idea that some particular ideology or model view, or kind of narrow set of ideologies or model views, to become globally but dominant and persist for an extremely long time. And I'm worried about that. I think that's a way in which the long-term future could go that could just lead to enormous loss of value, could make the future dystopia far more positive way. And, it's easiest to see this by starting off with maybe the most extreme case, and then kind of thinking about ways you might not be quite that extreme, but close. And the most extreme case is just imagine a different history where it wasn't, the US and UK and liberal countries that won World War II, and instead it was Stalinist USSR, or let's say the Nazis who won. Now, they really aimed ultimately at global domination. They wanted to create a 1,000-year empire. If that had happened, and they had a very narrow and morally abominable ideology, if they had succeeded, would that have been able to persist forever, or at least for an extremely long time? And I think actually the answer is yes, where ideologies in general and social systems can certainly persist for centuries or even thousands of years. So the major world religions are thousands of years old. But technology, I think, over time, will give us greater and greater power to control the values of the population that lives in the world, and the values in the future as well, where at the point in time where we develop the ability to stop aging, such that people's lifespans could last for much, much longer, well, then a single dictator could. It's not confined to the lifespan of their rule is not confined to the lifespan of a single individual, 70 years, but instead it would be thousands of years, or however long that ruler would last. Even more extreme, I think, is the point of time at which the ruling beings are digital rather than biological. And again, this feels like sci-fi, but we're talking about, I actually think many people I respect greatly think that moment is coming in a few decades' time. But let's just say it's plausible within this century or centuries. Well, consider what the environment is like for a ruler who is a digital being. Well, they don't die. They are in principle immortal. Software can replicate itself, and any piece of machinery would wear out, but the AI systems themselves could persist forever. So one of the main reasons why we get model change over time, namely that people die and are replaced by people who have slightly different views, that would be undermined. I think in this kind of scenario, other causes of change would be undermined too, or taken away. So I think the fact that we have competition between different model ideas, because we have this diversity of model ideas. Well, if the Nazis had won World War II, if they had established a world government, again, I'm not claiming this is likely or possible, but imagine the counterfactual history. Well, then we would lose out on that competition of ideas. There wouldn't be that pressure for model ideas to change. And then finally is just potentially a changing environment, like upsets happen, civilizations fall apart and so on. But I think technology in the future could allow for greater and greater stability. So again, I think AI is particularly worrying here where, again, we're imagining the leaders of the Nazis controlling the world. Okay, well, one way in which this can strikes, whether that's by the army or by the people. If your army is automated, if you have kind of robots in the streets, then that dynamic would end. Similarly with people. And again, all of this seems like sci-fi, but I think we should be thinking about it. We should be taking it seriously, because it really could come sooner than we think. And the technologies we have today would have looked like wild sci-fi just a century ago.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll close out with a conversation about AI, because I share your concern here, and I share your interest in elucidating the bad intuitions that make this not a concern for so many other people. So let's get there in a second, but remind me, what is the lock-in paradox that you talk about in the book?
Sure. So the lock-in paradox, it's like the literal paradox of tolerance. But, I push in the book that we don't want to lock in any particular values right now, because probably all of the values we're used to are abominable. I think we're like Plato and Aristotle arguing about the good life, and we've not realized the fact that we all own slaves is, maybe morally problematic. So I think that there's an enormous amount of moral progress yet to come, and we want to ensure that we guarantee that progress. And so even if, I think motivation of thinking, oh, well, it's, early 21st century Western liberal values, that's the best thing, and we should just ensure they happen forever. I'm like, no, we need progress. The lock-in paradox, however, is that if we want to create a world where we do get a sustained period of reflection and moral progress, that does mean we'll need some restraints. So we might well need to lock in certain ideas like commitment to free debate, commitment to tolerance of opposing moral views, restrictions on ways of gaining power that aren't via making good arguments and moving people over to your side. Kind of in the same way that, the US Constitution, at least aspirationally, is trying to bring about this liberal society where many different worldviews can coexist and where you can make moral progress. But in order to have that and not fall into dictatorship, you needed to have these restraints on any individual's power. And so I think we may well need something like that for the whole world, where we stop any particular ideology or just set people from gaining too much power such that they can just control the world, so that we can just have continued reflection, insight, empathy, and moral progress.
Yeah, it's tempting to try to formulate the minimum algorithmic statement of this, which is something that allows for the kind of incrementalism you've just sketched out and the error correction that I think is necessary for any progress, and including ethical progress, but which locks in the methodology by which one would safeguard the principle of error correction and sensitivity to the open-endedness of the exploration in ethical space, right? And it's like, I think there's probably, whether you define it as consequentialist or not, I think it's probably less important. I mean, the consequentialism, as we know, has its wrinkles, but I think there's an almost axiomatic claim about the primacy of safeguarding the well-being of conscious creatures at the bottom of, I think, any sane moral enterprise. Right now, it's not how you think about well-being, how you aspire to measure it or quantify it, how you imagine aggregating these quantities. There are many devils in all those details, but the basic claim that you have to, at bottom, care about the happiness and suffering of conscious creatures and marry that to a truly open-ended conception of, and perpetually refined and refinable conception of what well-being is, all things considered. And that's where all the discussion remains to be done. I think those are the bootstraps in some form that we have to pull ourselves up by.
So it is a very notable fact that I think basically all plausible moral views that are on the table see, well-being as one part of the good. Perhaps they think other things are good too, art, flourishing natural environment, and so on. But at least, happiness broadly construed, flourishing life, avoidance of suffering, those are good things. And
I would just not to be too pedantic here, but in my brain, all of that collapses to just a fuller understanding of what well-being is. I don't think any reasonable definition of well-being would exclude the things you just mentioned, and the cash value of the things you just mentioned has to be at some level how they impact the actual or potential experiences of conscious creatures. This is an argument I've made somewhere. You're going to tell me you've got something locked in a box that is really important, it's really valuable, it's important that we consider its fate in everything we do. But this thing in the box will not affect the experience of any conscious creature now or in the future. Right, well then I just think that's a contradiction. Right? What we mean by value is something that could be actually or potentially valued by someone somewhere.
Great, so I think we differ a little bit on this, where, I also think, my best guess is that value is just a property of conscious experiences. And, art and knowledge and the natural environment are all good insofar as they impact the well-being of conscious experiences. But that's not something I would want to bake in. I'm not so certain. There are other views where the satisfaction of what we consider preference is of positive value, even if that doesn't go by the change in any conscious experience. And other people do have the view that.
Sorry, again, that's a phrase I'm actually not familiar with. When I hear you say satisfaction of anything, including preferences, aren't we talking about conscious experience, actual or potential?
So on this view, it's no. So suppose that Aristotle wanted to be famous, and he wasn't very famous during his time. I'm actually not sure. Well, let's say that he was only much less famous than he is now.
Right.
Does the fact that we are talking about Aristotle now, increasing his fame, does that increase his well-being? And it's obviously not impacting his
I'm prepared to answer
experience.
that question.
I'm sure you're prepared to say no. And honestly, and my best guess view is completely agreeing with you that anything we do to talk about Aristotle now, we could say he smells and we hate him. It doesn't change his well-being at all. However, that's not true. Other people disagree. I think other smart people disagree. And so I certainly wouldn't want to say, look, we figured that out. I would want to say, look, now we've got plenty of time to debate this. I think I'm going to win the debate. Maybe the other person thinks they're not going to win the debate. But we've got all the time in the world to really try and figure this out. And I want to be open to possibilities that can battle with us.
Well, that's interesting. I would love to debate that. So maybe as a sidebar, you and I can figure out who and when and where.
Absolutely. Always happy to talk about, yeah.
Okay, well, so let's talk about AI, because it is, in some sense, the apotheosis of many of these concerns. And I agree that should anything like a malevolent AGI be built or be put in the service of malevolent people, the prospect of value lock-in and Orwellian totalitarianism, it just goes way, way up.
Yeah.
And it's worth worrying about, whatever you think about the importance of future generations. But there are several stumbling blocks on the path to taking these concerns about AI seriously. The first is, and this really is the first knee-jerk reaction of people in the field who don't take it seriously, it's the claim that we're nowhere near doing this, that our language models are still pretty dumb, even though they can produce some interesting texts at this point. There's certainly no concern that they could be anything like an intelligence explosion in any of the machine learning algorithms we're currently running. Alpha Zero, for all of its amazing work, is still not going to get away from us, and it's hard to envision what could allow it to. I know that there are people who, on our side of this debate, who have given a kind of probability distribution over the future, giving it, a 10% chance it might happen in 20 years and a 50% chance it'll happen within 50 years, etc. But in my mind, there's no need to even pretend to know when this is going to happen. The only thing you need to acknowledge is that not much needs to be true to make it guaranteed to happen. There are really two assumptions one needs to make. One assumption is we will continue to make progress in building intelligent machines at whatever rate, unless something terrible happens, right? This brings us back to the collapse of civilization. The only thing that would cause us to stop making progress in building intelligent machines, given how valuable intelligence is something truly awful that makes it, render some generation of future humans just unable to improve hardware and software. So there's that. Barring catastrophe, we're going to continue to make progress. And then the only other assumption you need is that intelligence is substrate independent, right? That it doesn't require the wetware of a biological brain. It can be instantiated in silico. And we already know that's true, given the piecemeal AI we've already built. And we already know that you can build a calculator that's better than any human brain calculator, and you can do that in silicon. And there's just no reason to think that the input-output properties of a complex information processing system are magically transformed the moment you make that system out of meat. And so, again, given any rate of progress, and given the assumption of substrate independence, eventually, and again, the time horizon is going to be left totally unspecified, 5 years or 500 years, eventually we will be in the presence of intelligent machines that are far more intelligent and competent and powerful than we are. And the only other point of confusion that I've detected here again and again and again, easily left to one side, is the question of consciousness. Will these machines be sentient? And that really is a red herring from my point of view. It's not a red herring ethically, it's incredibly important ethically, because if they are conscious, well then we can have a conversation about whether they're ethically suddenly more important than we are, or at least are equal, and whether we're creating machines that can suffer, etc., creating simulated worlds, they're essentially hell realms with sentient algorithms, and that would be a terrible thing to do. So yes, it's all very interesting to consider, but assuming that we can't currently know, and maybe one day never know, even in the presence of machines that say they're conscious and that pass the Turing test with flying colors, we may still be uncertain as to whether or not they're conscious. Whether or not they're conscious is a question that is totally orthogonal to the question of what it will be like to be in the presence of machines that are that intelligent, right? I mean, I think you can dissociate, or very likely you can dissociate consciousness and intelligence. And maybe the case that the lights of consciousness naturally come on once you get a sufficient degree of complexity and intelligence on board. That may just be a fact of our world, and we certainly have reason to expect that consciousness arrives far sooner than that. When we look around at animals, we see consciousness far less intelligent than we are. So I do think they're just separable questions, but the question of intelligence is really straightforward. We're talking about, conscious or not, we're talking about machines that can engage in goal-oriented behavior and learning in ways that are increasingly powerful and ultimately achieve a power that far exceeds our own, given that it seems virtually inevitable, given the human usual assumption that any progress in substrate independence for intelligence, we have to acknowledge that we, or our children or our grandchildren or some generation of human beings stand a very good chance of finding themselves in relationship to intelligence that are far more powerful than they are. And that's an amazing situation to contemplate. And I like to remind people of Stuart Russell's analogy here, which somehow, at least in my experience, changes people's intuitions. On his account, it's like we're in the following situation. We just got a message from some distant point in the galaxy which reads, "People of Earth, we will arrive on your planet in 50 or 75 or 100 years. Get ready." Right? You don't know when this is going to happen, but you know it's going to happen. And that statement of looming relationship delivered in that form would be quite a bit more arresting than the prospect of continued progress in AI. And, I would argue that it shouldn't be. I mean, they're essentially the same case.
Yeah, I just think that thing is excellent. And another thing is your chimpanzees and other species from decisions that are perhaps less powerful than you to begin with, but they seem to be getting rapidly increasing in their power. And we just be paying attention to them. And you remind me a little of the second book of the premise, what it says, aliens will come. I think it's in 1,000 years' time. And they have far much greater power than civilization on Earth. But the entire world just unites to take seriously that threat and work against it. And so essentially I completely agree with you that the precise timeline is just not very important compared to just noting not if, but basically when it happens that we have AI systems that can do everything that a human being can do, except better. That will be one of the most important moments in all of history, plausibly. And, well, we don't know exactly when it'll come, but uncertainty counts both ways. It could be hundreds of years, and it could be soon, for all we know. But certainly, relative to the tiny amount of time we're thinking about it, well, we should be spending more. But I'll actually just comment on the timelines as well, where there's a recent survey, just came out last week, in fact, of just as many leading machine learning researchers as possible. I'm not sure the sample size, but if it's like the last survey, it'll be in the hundreds. And they asked, well, at what point in time will you expect, do you expect a 50-50 chance of developing human-level machine intelligence? That is AI systems that are as good or better than human beings at all tasks, essentially, that humans can do. And they say 37 years. So that's in my lifetime. I will be entering my retirement with a 50-50 chance of advanced AI. When I talk to people who are really trying to dig into this, they often have shorter timelines than that. They often think that's 50-50 within more like 20 years, and substantial probability on shorter timelines. I tend to be on the more skeptical end of that, but basically within any of this range, concern about AI, it's not merely like, oh, we should be thinking about something that happens in 200 years because maybe that'll impact 2,000 years. It's like, no, we should be thinking about something that has a chance of catastrophe. Where on the same survey, the probability that those machine learning researchers, that's people who are building these things, who you think would be incentivized to say what they're doing is completely safe, the probability of an extremely bad outcome, as bad as team extinction or worse, the typical probability was 5%. So put those numbers together, and you have 2.5% chance of dying of being disempowered by AI. According to machine learning researchers, not cherry picked, being particularly concerned about this, you have a 2.5% chance of dying or being disempowered by artificial intelligence in your lifetime. That's more than your chance of dying in a car crash. And we think a lot about dying in car crashes. Take actions to avoid it. There's like a huge industry, a huge regulatory system, so that people do not die in car crashes. What's the amount of attention on risks from AI? Well, it's growing. Thankfully, it's growing. People are taking it really seriously. And I expect that to continue into the future. But it's still very small. It's still smart, knowledge, motivated people can make a really transformative difference in the field by getting involved, working on the technical side of things to ensure that our systems are safe and honest, and to also work on the governance side of things to ensure that we as a society develop this in a responsible way, perhaps digging into, AI is not a monolith. There are different sorts of AI technology, some of which are more risky than others, and ensuring that the safety enhancing parts of AI come earlier and the dangerous parts come later. This really is something that people can be contributing now. I think they are. I think it's hard. I'm not claiming that this is it's clear cut what to do. There are questions over how much progress we can make, but we can at least do.
Yeah, and I think the crucial piece there, again, occurs to Stuart Russell, who's my vote for one of the wisest people to listen to on this topic, just to make the safety conversation integral to the conversation about developing the technology in the first place. I mean, he asked us to imagine a world where how perverse it would be if engineers who were designing bridges thought about bridge safety only as an afterthought and great duress. The question about building bridges, all of the resources put toward that end, but then only as an afterthought do engineers have conversations about what they call the not falling down problem with respect to bridges, right? I mean, no, it's completely insane to conceive of the project of building bridges as being separate from the project of building bridges that don't fall down. Likewise, it should be completely insane to think about the prospect of building AGI without grappling with the problem of alignment and related matters. I mean, so in defense of more near-term concern here, many people have mined the history here and found these great anecdotes that reveal how bad we are at predicting technological progress. I forget the details of it. I think it was the New York Times or some esteemed U.S. paper that confidently published an editorial. I think it was just something like 2 months before the Wright brothers conquered flight. Confidently predicting that human beings will never fly, or it will take millions of years to engineer, because it took evolution millions of years to engineer the bird's wing. It would likewise take us millions of years to fly, and then 2 months later we've got people flying. And I think there's one anecdote that you have in your book that I hadn't heard, but the famous physiologist J.B.S. Haldane in 1927 predicted that.
This one, yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. What was that reference?
Oh yeah. Well, so yeah, one of the great scientists of his time, biologist, had some remarkable essays on the future and predicting future events of large civilizations. And he considered the question: will there ever be a return trip to the moon? And he said, oh yeah, probably 8 million years. And that was, did you say 1927? Yeah. So that shows you that people like to make fun of people in the past making these bold scientific predictions about technology, such as the early computer pioneers of the start of the 20s, saying, oh yeah, we'll build human-level artificial intelligence. We'll have 6 months before. People mock that, so that's also. But what they forget is that there are just as many people on the other side making absurd claims about how long technology is. In fact, things are hard to predict. Technology can come much later than you might expect. It can also come much sooner. And in the face of an uncertain future, we have to be prepared for the near-term scenarios as well as the long.
Yeah, and the thing we have to get straight in the meantime is that the incentives are currently not appropriate for wisdom and circumspection here. I mean, it's just we have something like an arms race condition, both with respect to private efforts and rival governments. We haven't fused our moral horizons with the Chinese and Israelis and anyone else who might be doing this work and gotten everyone to agree just how careful we need to be in the final yard of this venture. really close to the end zone, and it does seem patent or obvious that an arms race is not optimal for taking safety concerns seriously.
And I mean, the key issue is just how fast do things go. So supposing the development of artificial general intelligence, suppose that's 100 years away or 200 years away, then it seems more likely to me that safety around AI will look like safety around other technologies. So you mentioned flight. In the early days of flight, a lot of planes crashed, a lot of people died. Over time, we learned, primarily by trial and error, what systems make flight safer. And now very few people die in plane crashes compared to other modes of death, especially in more developed countries. But we could learn by trial and error, because a single plane crash would be a tragedy for the people involved and for their families, but it wouldn't destroy the whole world. And if AI development goes slowly, then I would expect we will learn by that same kind of process of trial and error and gradual improvement. But there are arguments for thinking that maybe it will go fast. In fact, leading economic models, if you assume that there is a point at which you get full substitutability between human labor and artificial labor, like as AI, in particular at the process of developing more advanced AI systems, then you get very fast growth indeed. And if things are moving that quickly, well, this slow incremental process of trial and error that humans normally use to mitigate the risks of new technology, that process is substantially disempowered, and I think that increases the risks greatly. And again, it's something that I really think, that prospect of very rapid growth is at least something that should be, very rapid progress, should at least be on the table. Where, again, the survey that just came out, US leading machine learning researchers, still, I'll caveat, I don't think they're really the people that one should think of as experts here, but they're still kind of relevant to consider. They think it's about even that will happen. It's about 50-50 chance that there will be something akin to what's known as the intelligence. So that doesn't necessarily mean the kind of classic, it's 2 days where we move from no effect AI to full the rest of the way to perhaps get there over the course of years, or even a small number of decades. But nonetheless, if things are moving a lot faster than they used to, I think that increases the risks greatly.
Well, it seems like things are already moving much faster than they used to. Yeah, it's hard to see where we get off this ride, because the pace of change is noticeably different. And I'm not a full Kurzweilian here, but it does seem like his claim about accelerating technological change is fairly palpable now. I mean, in most sectors, I guess there are sectors where virtually nothing is happening or improving, and that is also true. When we're talking about information technology and what it does to politics and culture, that's, the recent years have been a blizzard of change, and it's hard to know where the break is full.
Yeah, and people should just take a look at the recent developments in machine learning, where they're not very famous yet, but they will be soon, and it's truly remarkable what's happening. I mean, obviously, it's still far away from human-level artificial intelligence. I'm not claiming it's not. But when forecasts have been done, again, of people working in the area of what sort of progress we expect to make, things are moving faster, even than the forecast of people who thought it was going to be moving fast. So in particular, they're called language models. It's where they just get trained on enormous corpuses of human text. But one got trained to do math proofs, essentially, at about college level, kind of easy college level. And the innovation behind this model was very, very small indeed. They actually just cleaned up the data so that it really could read formula online, whereas that was a problem beforehand. And it just blew everyone's predictions out of the water. And so now you have this model where you say, you give it a mathematical problem, kind of early college level, prove that so-and-so, or what's the answer to this question if so, show a proof. And it will do it with 50% accuracy. And that was something that people weren't expecting for years. If you look at other language models as well, I mean, okay, I'll give an anecdote of, so one of my responsibilities for the university is marking undergraduate exams. And so I asked GPT-3, not even the most advanced language model nowadays, but one you can get public access to. I was curious, how good is GPT-3, this language model, compared to Oxford undergraduates at philosophy who studied philosophy for 3 years? And so I got it to answer these questions, some of the questions that the students most commonly answered.
That's great.
And it passed.
Yeah.
It was not very good. It was not terribly good. It was in the kind of bottom 10% of students, but not the bottom 2% of students. I think if I'd given the essays to a different examiner, I don't think that examiner would have thought, oh, there's something really odd here. This is not a human writing it. They would have just marked it and thought, not a very good student. A student that's good in some ways, has good structure. It like really knows the essay form, but sometimes gets like a little bit derailed by arguments that aren't actually relevant or something. That's what it would have thought, but would not have thought, oh, this is clearly nonsense. This is an AI or something. And that's just, that's pretty striking. We did not have anything close to that just a few years ago. And so, I don't know, anyone who's like this, I think it's fine to be like an enormous AI skeptic and think that AGI is very far away. Maybe that view's correct. Like I say, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. But at least take seriously, like, this is like a fast-moving area of technology.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously there are many interesting and consequential questions that arise well short of AGI. I mean, just on this front, I mean, what will be the experience of all of us collectively to be in the presence of AI that passes the Turing test, right? It does not have to be comprehensive AGI. It doesn't have to be empowered to do things out in the world. But just when Siri or Alexa become indistinguishable from people at the level of their conversation and, have access to the totality of human knowledge, when does Siri on your phone become less like a glitchy assistant and more like an oracle?
Yeah.
It's, that could be fairly near term, even with blind spots and, something that, disqualifies her as proper AI. I mean, I think the Turing test will fall for most intents and purposes. I mean, for some people, the Turing test has already fallen. I mean, we just have this kind of laughable case of the Google engineer who thought that, their current language model was sentient.
It was absurd.
Yeah, I mean, there was no reason to believe that. But I would be very surprised if it took more than a decade for the Turing test to fall for something like a chatbot.
I mean, I'm actually curious about why there haven't been attempts at the Turing test using language models. My thought is that they actually would have a pretty good chance of passing it. So I'm unsure on that. But one thing you mentioned is, this idea of like, oh, maybe rather than Siri, you have this incredibly advanced personal assistant. It's kind of like an Oracle. I just want to emphasize this is one of the examples where I talk about accelerating the kind of safer parts of AI and leaving, maybe slowing down and not investing much in the more dangerous parts, where this idea of kind of Oracle AI, just something that it's not an agent trying to pursue goals in the world. Instead, it's just this input-output function. You put in text, it outputs text. And it is like the most helpful, extraordinarily smart and knowledgeable person that you've ever met. That's a technology we want to have earlier rather than later, because that can help us with the scariest issues around alignment. That can help us. Yeah, that can help us align AI that is more like a kind of agent acting in the world. And some of the leading AI labs are taking exactly that approach. And I think that's the right way to go.
Well, Will, it's always fascinating. And
always a joy. Yep. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah. So to be continued. Best of luck with the book. Again, that is What We Owe the Future. And we have by no means covered all of its contents. And until next time, Will, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Sam.
This is the graphic story of a man who entered Germany's deepest cave when disaster struck. Viewer discretion is advised. by and other scientists say the Rysending cave system is almost certainly linked by an undiscovered super cave to another 50-mile-long labyrinth comprised of some 4,000 caves in neighboring Austria. Nobody knows where the link is. Finding it would be a sensation. At a press conference in Germany, it was said that the event had opened a new chapter in Alpine history regarding one of the most extensive rescue attempts in history. But unfortunately, this cave is so deep it is impossible to rescue anyone from it. The operation became well known to the general public for the great rescue effort, taking over 700 members of a multi-international group of cave rescuers, consisting of people from Italy, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Croatia, and others. The difficulty and complexity of the operation was unprecedented. In August 2015, the Interior Ministry of Bavaria reported the costs were estimated at around 960,000 euros. According to the Swiss rescue team leader, Andy Schuer, the different international groups had grown into one big family during the mission. At the same time, the Austrian representative said that even the strongest lads had tears in their eyes while conducting the mission. The danger of future missions in Rysending Cave is just too great, said Thomas Weber, the mayor of the district. As a result of this incident, the entrance to the cave was sealed by police to prevent further accidents by curious people and tourists. A special permit was required and only issued to people with justified interest, physical suitability, and professional qualification. Johann Westhauser is a 52-year-old from Stuttgart, Germany. He works as a scientist at the Karlsruhe Technology Institute and is part of a team that discovered the Rysending cave system in Germany in 1995. He's an experienced caver and probably knows the Rysending cave as well as anyone else on Earth. Johann is no amateur in caving and has explored the Rysending system with his team named the Bad Kennstadt Cave Research Group many times. He is one of the founders of the group. The thrill of exploring the undiscovered parts of this cave was so intense for him that he returned again and again to discover its extremities. But now he wanted to push his exploration to the limits. So he planned the most extensive and risky expedition to re-enter the cave and take a shot at finding the connection to the super cave. The Rysending's name translates as gigantic thing. The cave is awe-inspiring, and once you enter and get a sense of the cave, it is like you have entered another planet. At 63,320 feet, it is the longest, and 3,760 feet, the deepest in Germany. So far, only 12 miles of its hundreds of tunnels, which plunge to a depth of 3,300 feet, have been mapped. The complex is a maze of blind alleys, waterfalls, chasms, and rock chimneys. The cavers must move along its damp, often slimy, rock-strewn passageways, then squeeze through water-filled gaps less than 2 feet wide. Most of the cave system remains unexplored. The exploration of this cave is analogous to an out-of-body experience. This place will be your worst nightmare if you are afraid of heights or risk-adverse. Researchers say this cave system is the last undiscovered continent. You can discover new, unexplored territory here. The cave was formed by acid-charged rain and groundwater seeping through openings in the limestone near the peak of the Untersberg Massif, a 6,400-foot tabletop mountain that towers over the landscape between Germany and Austria. Over time, the porous limestone dissolved away, leaving behind caverns and shafts like a river carving a canyon. Because it begins on the top of such a large mountain, the water-formed Rysending had a long way to travel before coming to rest at the water table, making it much more profound than other similar cave systems. Legend has it that 12th century Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I is asleep deep inside the Untersberg mountain, poised to wake and restore Germany to its ancient greatness as soon as its beard grows around the table 3 times, or the ravens cease flying. So everyone has to be extra quiet inside. The Rysending is called a pit cave because of its vertical orientation, making it so technically challenging to traverse. Because the access shaft has much of the interior structure run straight up and down, cavers must descend and ascend on ropes for large parts of the cave's length. This requires expert-level caving experience and is terrifying. Something was alluring about the feeling of remoteness for Johann, but he knew that preparation would be necessary for this environment to survive. Climbing was one thing, but exploring a cave like this added a new element for Johann that he and his colleagues needed to prepare for. Traditional rock climbing techniques are often infeasible or impossible in a deep pit cave like this. So instead, they had to use a unique piece of equipment called an ascender to inch back up to the same rope they used to rappel down, a technique sometimes called jummering or jugging. Reaching the bottom of this cave is never accomplished on a single trip by a single team. Therefore, the team brought hundreds of pounds of rope and associated hardware, along with food, water, lights, batteries, and a first aid kit. They were going all in on this expedition, despite the high risk of injury or death. Navigating this cave is a physical, technical, and even mental challenge. Johan and his colleagues spent weeks getting into shape to maximize their exploration of this cave and to allow them the greatest safety and make their movements easier. Then, they planned out their descent into the cave with detailed plans for each step of the way. If you're headed to the bottom of Rysending, you'll also need to bring a boat. About 3,051 feet below the entrance point, there is a vivid blue lake that must be crossed by a raft to proceed deeper into the cave. Swimming is not an option, with temperatures constantly hovering around freezing and humidity around 100%. Around 12 p.m. noon on the 7th of June 2014, Johan and two colleagues entered the Rysending cave. Once they entered, they immediately had to get down the first deep shaft by anchoring ropes and rappelling down to the bottom. Once there, they reached the first base station. They were filled with excitement and determination to make it down the ropes. Foot by foot, they lowered themselves down the cold, damp cave with little to no light. They managed to make it down without any issues, but they were utterly exhausted from the descent. The cave was proving to test more than they were expecting, but they pressed on. Their blood was pumping hard, and they had to work for each breath. Johan felt strange as he strapped up to descend the second shaft. Although he had been planning this trip for a long time, he realized he was just going through the motions and not connecting with his colleagues. He was laser focused on the task at hand because he knew how dangerous this exploration was, and any error in judgment could lead to his or one of his team members' death. Even still, he decided to pay more attention to his teammates and live in this glorious moment. They started lowering themselves down the next shaft. The shaft was straightforward, and they could make it down to base station 2 pretty easily. One of the teammates started to become distant, and Johan realized he was experiencing a bit of shock from the expedition. The teammate's eyes were glazed over, and he wasn't listening to instructions. If he didn't snap out of this, they would have a major safety issue. Johan gave him a pep talk, and they decided to continue. The three then started to descend to the next station. Right from the start, Johan was having a hard time making his way down. The walls of this part of the cave were lined with loose rocks that were jagged in some places and could cause ropes to get snagged. Johan's rope was getting stuck on something, and he knew this could cause a rockfall. The team continued to work their way down the shaft, but the cave walls were starting to become more dangerous the lower they went. Rocks were beginning to break from the sides of the walls, and the team could not see where they were falling from. It was pitch black, besides the small headlamps that each team member was wearing on top of their safety helmet. The team stopped to talk about the falling rock issue and decided that they had come too far to turn back and use that ascender to inch back up to the cave entrance. They might not have had enough energy to make it back up, so their only option was to go down. Johan's heart began to race, and his mind was running with all of the potential scenarios that could happen next. Somehow, he was able to snap out of this and refocus. The descent was starting to get dangerous very quickly, and they all did a prayer before starting to work their way down the ropes again. Finally, after some time, they made it down to base station number 3. They had one more challenging descent to make, and then they would be at the long straight part of the cave. This passage was horizontal and would give the group some time to rest from all of the descending. The team made it down to base station 4, but they were tired at this point. Things were going according to plan as they worked their way down the long straight passage. They had been in the cave for over 10 hours, and their focus and decision-making abilities were starting to wane. After a couple more hours, they finally made it to base station number 5, and a feeling of exhilaration came over the team. This was a big deal because once they got past the next marker, base station 6, they would be at the undiscovered part of the cave. This was the whole reason they were there for. Then, they realized there was a problem. This part of the cave is treacherous, and there was an increased chance of something threatening happening. If they get injured this deep in the cave, there is no way they would get out, and this cave would end up being their tomb. At the end of the long straight, the team came to a part of the passage that was made up of loose rock. They were anticipating this part and decided to push forward to get across and make it to base station 6. Johan led the way and worked his way over the slippery rocks with one thing on his mind: to make it across safely. He was doing okay, but the rocks started falling from the ceiling, and he needed to take cover. It was pitch black, so spotting the falling rocks was almost impossible. Out of nowhere, Johan was struck in the head by a large boulder and knocked unconscious. The rock hit him so hard it cracked through his plastic helmet. His body crumbled to the ground, The only sounds were those of the rocks that continued to fall. Johann was no match for the rock fall. His body was lifeless, and there was nothing he could do to protect himself. At this time, the team had descended 3,280 feet down the cave. One of the teammates saw the whole thing happen to Johann and knew that the exploration was immediately over. It crossed their mind that a rescue operation would offer Johann very little to no hope. They feared this moment happening, and it happened. The two teammates were in shock. Johann was a good friend of theirs, and seeing him in this condition was heart-wrenching. They decided that one would stay with Johann and the other would return to the surface to get help. After 10 hours, the teammate made it safely to the cave entrance. After taking a massive gulp of fresh air and thanking God he made it, he called Mountain Rescue. The emergency crew jumped into action and started to plan the rescue of Johann from deep in the cave. Austrian rescuer Norbert Rosenberger told Germany's newspaper on Friday that the feat would be more complicated than retrieving an injured climber from the summit of Mount Everest. It would be one of the most extreme and dangerous rescue attempts ever made. About 2 days after Johann entered the cave, 3 groups of cave rescuers, 11 people in total, entered the cave to make their way toward him and the remaining teammate. A cave link system was established to send and receive essential communication signals through the solid rock, allowing the exchange of text messages between the cave entrance and the scene of the accident. The transport through the narrow passages and supplies of people inside and outside of the cave was challenging. The stretcher had been made shockproof to a certain extent. On the evening of June 11th, a physician reached Johann. He assessed him, and a minor traumatic brain injury was diagnosed. And a second physician arrived later that night. It was decided that Johann was fit to be transported out of the cave. The paths within the cave had to be secured with additional fixed ropes, bolts, and footrests. At peak times, up to 60 people were in the cave, and 90% of all cave rescue equipment of the Bavarian Mountain Rescue had been used. Unfortunately, there were no engines or other machinery available, so all work had to be done by hand. In vertical passages, the rescue staff used their own bodies as a counterweight to the stretcher. Bavarian Mountain Rescue authorities confirmed that Johann had been brought to the top of the cave on June 19th at 11:44 a.m. Shortly after midday, he was airlifted to a hospital in Bavaria. Johann had to spend about 2 weeks in the trauma center, including an operation the following week for his cheekbone fracture, and then undergo several months of rehabilitation. I want to say thanks for watching the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you like the content. As always, please be nice to the like button, and I have many other disaster videos on my channel that you might want to check out. Hope to see you at the next one.
turret has been destroyed. Your team has destroyed a